Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Tech Talks with Santosh. And today we are going to talk about Julia Lang. So, in case you're interested, Logan is the community manager for Julia Lang, and he also works as AI/ML engineer. So, he'll be letting us know everything about Julia Lang, what are the features and everything. So, let's go ahead and get started. And over to you, Logan. So, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. No, I'm super excited to be here, Santosh, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about Julia to folks. Yeah, my name is Logan Kilpatrick. I'm the community manager for the Julia language, and sort of one of the opportunities that I get as part of that role is the opportunity to go and talk to folks about Julia, which I love and is always a ton of fun. So again, super excited to be here.
Thanks. That's great. So, thanks a lot, Logan, for joining us. And so, should I add the slides? I mean,
Yeah,
you want
let's.
to start with that? Yep. So
Yeah.
here it is. So Julia Lang. So tell us about everything about Julia language.
Yeah, no, I love it. I'm super excited. So there's going to be a ton of things that we go through.
Mm-hmm.
I'll sort of and this is just what the slides that I have cover, but we can
Mm-hmm.
sort of take this in whatever direction we want, which is awesome. So I can go a little bit into sort of what Julia is, why folks might want to use it. I have
Mm-hmm.
some of my favorite features that I can highlight, and then at the end, if folks are perhaps interested in contributing to the language or learning how you can leverage it in your own workflows, we can also talk about that. So happy to dive into what Julia is, unless there's initial questions.
Sure, sure. Let's get started.
Cool beans. So I think one of the things that I love to do when talking about Julia is just sort of taking a step back almost and
Mm-hmm.
thinking about sort of the landscape of things and why we might need another programming language in order to solve some of the problems that we have. So I think in the case of Python, this or rather in the case of all of the programming languages right now, there's definitely some fundamental barriers. Like if you want to try to use some of the other existing tools to solve problems. You may or may not have run into this, but there's definitely some fundamental limits as far as the computational power that Python or MATLAB or R actually provide to you. And there,
Mm-hmm.
there's some ways that you can sort of get around that by writing your code in certain ways or using some sort of optimization tools. But the reality is, there's overhead to all of those things. You need people, either you yourself need to know how to use those tools, or you need to work with somebody else who knows how to use those tools. So Julia really comes in and helps solve this problem in the sense of you have one tool that sort of does the job for you, and you don't need, multiple languages and all this other stuff in order to solve whatever the computational challenges that you're trying to solve. So that's sort of the picture that I like to paint for folks initially. And if we dive into some of the other specifics, all of this, the sort of entire value add proposition of Julia is that you can shorten down the innovation cycle. And there's a bunch of different ways that this actually materializes. In a lot of senses, it's the speed of the language. It's the reproducibility that the language has built in. So you don't need to spend a much time being like, okay, well, the code, you don't need to send that message that every developer sends in their life. It worked on my machine, which is always, it's always funny to send that message. But I really think in the context of Julia, you can sort of get around that situation because the dependency management and some of the baked in reproducibility features just work, which is super awesome. Um, and sort of an aside to that, I personally think that one of the really great things about Julia as a language is actually the community that surrounds it. I think it's one of the best things about it, about the language, in my opinion, is that there's a lot of people who are super passionate and they are always willing to spend time to help other people, which I think is super, super cool and not necessarily something you see in some of these other domains.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the speed and reproducibility, again, what that results in is for a developer or for a developer team, if you have that speed and reproducibility, you end up saving money, you end up being able to do things faster, which is ultimately what a lot of people want to do. So it's super fun and interesting in that regard. If we look again at a super high level of some of the quote unquote features of the language, Julia is obviously open source on GitHub. the language is reproducible, it's fast. In a lot of cases, the language itself, some of the specific problems that it's being used to solve are a lot of the times very data intensive problems, or problems that are specifically in like the computational science domain. So Julia is a general purpose programming language. You could use it to do, web scraping or something like that if you wanted to. But a lot of the specific use cases are like, how do we use Julia to solve this climate change problem or something that's much more grandiose than like web scraping in a lot of cases. So very interesting in that sense. Syntax is also super familiar. If you've used Python before, Julia should be syntactically very familiar to you. And the language itself is dynamic and composable, which is always important. So those are really some high level features of the language. We can sort of dive into some of the syntactic features of the language, if you will. And I also have a bunch of use cases that I can sort of provide for folks.
Yeah, let's do that. I mean,
so if we talk about some of these use cases, there's two that are definitely my favorite to talk about, and also happy to answer questions about these specific use cases. But one of them is the Pumas project, and the Pumas project is basically a bunch of folks in the pharmaceutical domain working with folks in the sort of computational science domain, specifically people using Julia, and they're using Julia as a tool to help solve a lot of these pharmacological, I think is the correct word, problems. And it's just such an interesting problem to me. I think I love this use case just because it makes so much sense. They're working on one of the specific use cases is this notion of personalized medicine, and it really, in my mind, it's very outdated, the fact that we all go to the doctor and they sort of just, because that's the way that it's been done in the past, they like write you a prescription for like the same thing that someone else who has a different body, who has a different like physical chemistry inside of their body would be doing. Like, for example, if we're both sick with the same symptoms, they're going to give us the same prescription for take 2 of these pills 3 days a week for the next month, or whatever it is. And again, the reality is I eat different food than you. I exercise in a different way than you. I'm a different height, a different weight. So it's seemingly unintuitive, the fact that they would give us the same prescription. And that's actually one of the things that the Pumas project is using. They're using Julia sort of as their computational tool to help solve this problem. And it's super interesting. I'm really excited about this, and I think it'll truly have a super significant impact. And again, what they're doing computationally is super intensive. So they made the decision to use Julia as sort of the tool for this job. And this Pumas AI, this organization, also has a bunch of other really interesting projects. Like they help Pfizer and Moderna with the COVID-19 vaccine, which is super important and impressive. So lots of really cool stuff happening in this domain around Julia, which is awesome to see.
wow.
Yeah. And the other use case, which I really enjoy, is the Klima Project. So the Klima Project is a group of organizations based out of Caltech that have come together to actually help build the next generation of climate models. And basically the idea is, if we want to understand how to solve climate change, the sort of the first step to doing that is in a lot of senses, understanding what the problem actually is. And this, we hear all this conversation around, we know the earth is getting warmer, we know all these bad things are happening, but that's true. We do know those things are happening. We only know, the specifics to a certain degree, just because of the complexity of the system of the earth that exists right now is extremely complicated. And if you want to try to model some of these systems, it becomes a really, really difficult problem to do. So the folks at Caltech, when they created the Klima Project, they were trying to understand, what is the right tool for this job? And they ultimately chose Julia, and are now building this, scalable open platform that will hopefully be the next generation of climate modeling, which I think is super exciting and is such an important problem for humanity to help solve. So these are, again, some of the use cases that get me excited. And hopefully for folks, the takeaway from all this is, Julia might be worth trying. I'm not sure. Maybe I haven't convinced everybody yet, but I think it's perhaps something that folks will give a shot. And if this is something that's of interest to you, and you're like, okay, I'm convinced. Maybe I want to learn Julia. What might the next step be? I think for a lot of folks, we've seen this course at MIT. The awesome people at MIT at the Julia lab there have a course that they're teaching, and they're teaching it in such a way that it's open to everyone in the world. So you don't have to be an MIT student. You can go and take this class and interact with the professors and talk to some of the other students, which is super cool, super unique. And again, just MIT doing MIT things. So it's really awesome. And if you want to learn Julia, this would be a great opportunity to do so. The link is just computationalthinking.mit.edu. So lots of fun, definitely worth checking out if you want to learn Julia sort of in a more traditional way through a university classroom.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So about those two projects, so I like those organizations are working in collaboration with Julia team.
Yeah, that's a great question. So both of those projects have a bunch of folks who actually work as part of the Julia project is a open source project through a like sort of facilitated through a nonprofit. But there's also sort of independent from that, there's a for-profit company called Julia Computing. And a lot of the folks who created the Julia language actually work at Julia Computing now, is sort of doing it as their full-time job, just because I'm sure, as doing open source stuff is difficult to do as a full-time job. It's, the money's not just pouring out of the sea. So they have that for-profit company, and that's where a lot of the sort of Julia expertise comes into play. And they help a lot of these companies, both at Pumas AI and the Klima Project.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, we can know.
Cool beans. So if we talk about some of the most interesting features, and we'll perhaps only dive into a couple of these unless there's specific questions around some of them. But again, if we look at one of the things that, and I don't have the screenshot on my computer, but I just saw this on Twitter the other day. Someone was like, the quote was verbatim. It was like, Python is easy to install. It takes like 30 minutes right after you've reset your computer to factory default or something to that effect. And basically the gist is it's really difficult to manage Python on your computer locally. And I've run into this problem many times on my own, like just trying to get things to work that say they should work, but they just don't for whatever reason. And again, I think that's a lot of the case because Python is like very intertwined with the operating system in some cases. Like it's actually used to do like underlying system calls, so you can't mess with it that much. And again, the result of that is kind of a headache for the end user, which is not always great. So it's something I appreciate so much about Julia. I can install it. It just works, which I love and is super helpful. And then also sort of the extension of that is the package manager ecosystem. Again, I think it's extremely cumbersome to install packages in a bunch of other languages. I love the Julia package manager. It's one of the features where I'm like, if every language had this, I think humanity would be better off. So hopefully other languages are able to sort of pick up on this and take it forward. But also, again, hitting home on the speed of things and what that enables you to do. It's actually really crazy if you look at some of the other use cases that the Julia Computing team has on their website, or if you just look on Twitter, you should be able to see people talking about simulations that they had in MATLAB and then rewriting them in Julia and getting like a 60x improvement in speed or something like that. And again, that just enables so much more innovation when you can do something like that. And then the last piece, again, the reproducibility is I think, super important, especially in open source and things like that. You want to write code that other people can actually use, and
Mhm.
the code has to be reproducible for that to be the case. So if we look really quickly at the package manager, and this is just giving a quick demo. So if you open up the Julia REPL and you type a left-facing square bracket, that will enter you into the package manager. And then you can do something quite simply like just add and then the name of the package. And the package will just, it'll go into the registry, it'll add the package, and you'll be able to download it from the Julia registry or from any other registry that you have. During this quick demo that I was recording before, I spelled the name wrong of the package, of course, as one does. But again, I think it's super intuitive to use this package manager and to get everything installed. And I think what this results in for the Julia ecosystem long term is, again, a package ecosystem that's easier to use and perhaps a little bit more friendly than some of the existing solutions. Like I think pip is a great tool for installing Python packages. It just, again, there's a lot of challenges that come with doing that.
Okay.
And then again, from the package manager, you can just type the word status. It'll give you a direct link to the environment file. It'll tell you what packages you have installed. There's the capacity to add other registries. So if you want to, like in the example of pip or the general Julia registry, those are sort of like managed by this consortium or community, but you can also create your own custom registries if you're an academic lab or a corporate company or just an individual who wants to publish a bunch of Julia packages. You can sort of put all those together into a single registry, and then give folks access to that, which I think, again, is super helpful. And that's a really easy and intuitive process to do, which, again, bodes well for the long-term sustainability of the ecosystem.
Okay, so about this registry part, I mean, how it would be like, so I create a new package and then I have to push this on your registry, right? I mean, the common registry, which is managed by the Julia team, is it?
Yes. Yeah, so
Okay.
that's in the case of the general registry. So there's a website and there's a workflow and there's a few different ways to do it if you want to get a package registered on the general Julia registry. But then again, you can actually, create your own registry if for whatever reason. Like I know a lot of the example that always comes to my mind is there's a lab at Stanford that I've worked with before, and they have like a ton of packages and they put all those packages together into their own registry that they distribute to people. Just because of how many packages they have, it just makes it a little bit easier for them to manage all that. And again, you can just literally, you type registry add and then like the URL of the registry on GitHub, and then boom, you have access to all of those packages as well.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
great.
it's pretty neat, and it's really helpful in the case of when you start getting into these more complicated workflows, like you're working on cross-functional teams where you're using the general Julia registry, you're also using like some private internal registries, and like working with all these different organizations, it becomes really easy to manage all these things directly in the Julia package manager. And you can manage the packages, see which registries they're from, see all of those different things. And I think I've done that exact use case before, and it's intuitive, which is super helpful, and it just makes life less headaches, which I can appreciate.
Right. Just another question regarding the same, right? So in Python, we generally create a requirement.txt file to make sure that whatever packages we have, it's added in requirement.txt and shared. How about Julia? How we do that?
This is a great question. So this goes back to the reproducibility piece, and I think what you just described is sort of the ideal situation in the Python landscape. And even in that ideal situation, I get code from folks that I work with all the time that has a requirements.txt file, and it does not actually work. Like I go and do pip install -r requirements.txt, and things do not work for whatever reason it is, whatever is in their txt file. they're using packages that aren't cross-compatible or what have you. I run into that situation all the time, and I have yet to run into that situation in the Julia domain. And Julia uses sort of a twofold approach to solve this reproducibility problem. We have a project file, and then there's a manifest file. The project file has all the specific requirements, like the packages that you're actually using in your code. And then the manifest file has sort of more in line with if you were to do like a pip freeze and sort of just take a snapshot of all of the packages that have been installed in that environment. That's what the manifest file is there for. And it just includes like the dependencies of the projects or of the packages which you've installed. So your project file just has the specific ones that you're using. The manifest file has all the dependencies of the individual packages that you're using. So it's a little bit more verbose in that sense.
Got it. I mean, so in JavaScript, we have log files. So similar to that.
Yeah, it's probably much more similar to lock files. And again, you have all this, there's a bunch of baked in features as far as the project and manifest file go, and you can set specific upper and lower bounds for packages, for versions of Julia. You can specify specific packages for like testing and things like that. So it's what I think sort of more in line with what the future of a project or a manifest or file will look like, and how to manage these dependencies in a super complex environment. I think the way that those files are set up is intuitive, and it's like it's much more transparent to me. I think one of the problems that I have with and perhaps I just don't know the commands as well, but with pip and things like that, it's always unclear to me like where things are being installed, like how I can see where they're being installed. And if we watch this video again, when you type the status keyword, it actually just like tells you exactly where let me see where it is, exactly where the file is located. So I can then go to my Julia folder and look at environment 1.6, and I can go open up that project file and see it and actually see what's in there, which is, again, super helpful for me as a developer when I'm sort of going through these workflows. And Santosh, I don't know if I'm frozen or you're frozen, but now I can see you.
Yeah, so my internet is really bad today. I'm on my secondary internet now.
Yeah, you need the secondary internet these days.
Yeah. Okay. So Rishit said Julia seems so cool. I usually work with ML and have heard about Julia for this. Excited to try. For sure, Rishit. I mean, so in case you're not aware, Rishit is doing a lot of stuff in ML and AI community. He's contributing to a lot of open source projects as well. And some of them actually like given shout out by even Google and Microsoft as well. So he's
awesome.
doing some of things. Yeah. And he's a student and he's just a student still. I mean, he's even not a professional.
Rashid, I would give a look at some of the Julia machine learning packages. And what I think is so cool about what's happening in the machine learning space in Julia is sort of twofold. I think the first thing that I really appreciate in the machine learning ecosystem is that all of the Julia packages in the domain are written in Julia themselves. And this is one of the interesting things. If you look at a lot of the machine learning packages in the Python ecosystem, it's a Python package, but really they're just making calls to C++. There's no, like the core code is C++. So if you want to go and contribute to those things, you have to know C++. And I can say for myself, I took C++, but it's been a while since I've actually done development, and I don't enjoy doing development in C++. I don't want to have to deal with pointers and all that stuff. It's not fun for me. So that might be some motivation if you're sort of over pointers and want to do machine learning stuff and want to contribute. If you know Julia, you also know how to contribute to the base language. Julia is written in Julia, which is really cool. And all the machine learning packages are written in Julia. It's 100% Julia, which is awesome. The other thing is that because of all of this, there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination across the ecosystem. So I think more so than you see in a lot of these other languages, because of sort of the paradigm of multiple dispatch and the dynamic nature of Julia, you can just basically out of the box, like take a machine learning package and take something like, the differential equations packages, and they just like work together in tandem without having to like do any like weird changes to the other, pieces of code. So you see this all the time where people are able to just leverage these tools to solve a problem that, you may not be able to solve in another space just because of how well these tools interplay together. So definitely something to look into if machine learning is what gets you excited. There's so much interesting work that can be done in the Julia space, and it gets me excited. I'm like, I wish I had 40 hours a week to just do, cool, interesting machine learning stuff in the Julia space, just because I think there's so much impact that can be had in that area.
Awesome.
Yeah. So sort of going off this conversation as far as like how folks can get involved in the community, I think there's a bunch of different ways that a bunch of different avenues and opportunities for people. One of the key ones that there's sort of the basic ideas. You can contribute code, go find issues, go write packages. You can contribute documentation. I think that's a lot of times the starting point for folks. If what I always suggest people to do is if there's something that interests you in the Julia domain or really any open source project, go read the documentation, see if there's things that don't make sense to you. And that's your sort of, getting started contribution. Just go say, hey, this couple of sentences or this example, isn't super clear. Here's how I think it can be improved. And maybe they'll say, that's not how we want to improve things, but there's also a chance that they say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thanks for that contribution. The other really interesting space that I think folks a lot of the time overlook in the Julia community is what I would consider to be like a non-technical contribution. And I think even something like this presentation would sort of fall, it's technical somewhat in nature, but I think in a lot of cases, it doesn't fall under the scope of like what people think about in open source. And I think Santosh, you probably know this as well as anyone. This recording this video and hosting this session sort of doesn't show up as a contribution on GitHub, but it's entirely an open source contribution through and through. As open source as it can be, this presentation is a contribution. So I think there's a ton of opportunities for folks to make those more like non-traditional open source contributions. And a lot of the time, like that's such a great avenue to go and, make a code contribution somewhere where it's important to you and you're excited. Going and making these non-technical contributions, going and making documentation contributions are a great pathway to ultimately contributing some code in the end, if that's what you want to do.
Great.
This is a slide that I have up for specifically around like students getting involved in open source, and these quotes are directly from a Forbes article where the people at Forbes were interviewing recruiters and people and asking what are some of the skills or things that we would want out of a student when we're actually going and hiring them to come into our company. And again, I think this is important to think about just because a lot of the sort of buzz in open source these days is students actually. And I think the reason is very simple. There's no sort of barriers. There's barriers to contributing to open source, but the barriers aren't sort of the traditional barriers that you see. Like no one cares in open source, where you went to school, what your GPA is, like none of that stuff matters, which is super cool. And I think that's one of the things that gets me excited about open source is it's much more, as the name says, open to people who are just willing to go and contribute. And it's also a great avenue for people who, let's say you don't have an internship this summer or something like that. You can just go and write code and contribute, and no one can tell you that you can't, which is, again, super cool. And people care a lot about the work that you do. And I think it sort of flips a lot of the sort of traditional way that things have happened on its head. Because, again, if you can go and make a quality contribution to some open source package, they're going to accept that regardless of if you got a D in your math class last semester. They don't care. So I think that's super exciting and super liberating. And again, for students, a lot of the quotes that you see on the screen are very much in line with some of the open source principles. Self-motivated, excited about technology. That's open source. Offering a fresh perspective. A lot of the time, the packages and things that are happening in open source are actually ahead of some of the industry stuff, just because of the nature of how open source happens and how it changes. It's a lot of the time the new stuff is in the open source domain. And then real world experience outside of the classroom is super important. And that's open source through and through. A real world experience outside of the classroom is what open source is. So I think these are all, again, the high level idea is open source is where students get this opportunity to really sort of advance themselves and also contribute to something that's super meaningful. Santosh, I don't know about who, like the demographic of your audience, but I would guess that there's probably a bunch of students in this audience. So hopefully this is helpful for folks.
I mean, I can see in last few years, like a lot of students are actually driving the Indian open source community. If you see, I mean, all of them students, most of the developers I like interact with, at the end I realize they tell me I am still, like, I have like 6 months to finish my college. I'm like, what? I mean, you
Yep.
have done so much of open source contribution and you are still need to finish your college. I mean, that's amazing. So of course I see a lot of I mean, a lot of good things coming in more years from India, of course.
Yeah, I truthfully, one of the things that I've realized in the last few years is that the developer community in India and specifically the open source developer community in India is unparalleled. I think there's obviously a lot of really cool things happening in the US, but I would not bet against the open source community in India. There's so many folks, people are so passionate, and I think you see this in the demographic of or some of the distribution of people in Google Summer of Code. But Google Summer of Code is, almost, I think it's 50+% people in India, which is super awesome and really interesting. And I think a testament to the strength of the open source community in India. It's awesome to see all the new initiatives, like all the GitHub stuff that's happening in India. And there's so many new programs taking place there. So it's super exciting. I love it. It's awesome. And even in the Julia community, I think I think more than half of our Google Summer of Code students come from India. It's like way more than half too. I'm pretty sure it's like 70% most of the time.
Wow.
So yeah, lots of great folks coming out of India.
That's great. So there is a question from Lalit. So let's take it. So are there any practical consumer-oriented use cases that would be tracked by Julia, non-scientific computing cases? What would be motivation for use case to think Julia above JS or Python?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think where Julia as a language really shines through is the scientific computing use cases. So I think the practical consumer example perhaps that I gave around personalized medicine, like the end game for that use case is you go into your doctor and in some form or fashion they're running, they're obviously not like having a Julia script up on their computer and like changing variables and stuff like that. Like it'll be sort of more consumer orientated technology, but the underlying technology that's providing that service is going to be Julia. So I think that's a perfect use case for Julia in sort of a consumer orientated fashion. There's a lot of sort of analog examples to that. If you go to juliacomputing.com, they actually have a whole section of a bunch of really awesome case studies. But again, a lot of in certain cases, a lot of like these consumer problems, you can sort of solve these. JavaScript is a great example of this. You can build websites and have logic and everything that you need using JavaScript. So I don't think necessarily Julia is like competing against JavaScript in a lot of ways. There's a different subset of problems which JavaScript and Python don't necessarily solve that I think Julia does solve really, really well.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, great question. And the case studies on the Julia Computing website, I think will be very sort of apparent as far as what some of these problems are. Like lots of analytics problems, lots of really like the FAA uses a platform called ACAS-X, which was developed out of that same lab at Stanford that I was talking about that has a private or a publicly available Julia registry. And that sort of touches all of our lives if you live in the US or perhaps abroad and fly. The aircraft avoidance technology that determines like, where should the airplanes fly so that people don't run into each other. That's, using Julia. And that doesn't, again, you don't see that technology, but it's there and it's helping improve everybody's life, which is super cool.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we are done with the questions. I mean, we don't have any question in chat, so we can move ahead.
Cool. Again, I would just say at a high level, some of the and this is sort of my wrapping up of these slides. At a really high level, the value that I see for people getting involved in open source is being able to leverage this community. And I think again, sort of going back to what we talked about before, if one of the most powerful things for people to have in their life and in their career is other folks to advocate for them. I think that's something that I've seen so much for myself in open source. Like, I've done some work in open source and it's sort of publicly available to everybody to see. And now the people that I've worked with will be like, hey, yeah, Logan is actually, he can do a pretty decent job writing Julia packages or whatever it is. And again, you have this public testament. Other people can see that and then be your advocate, which I think is super important. You also, again, just have this community of folks that you can work with. And I think what's interesting about this is it's specifically folks who like want to be there, which I think is super exciting. Like Santosh, I'm sure you see this all the time, and it's something that I love tremendously. Like, to a certain extent, like neither of us are being paid to do this right now. Like we're doing it because again, we think it's interesting and we think it's fun and we like open source and we like technology and all these things. And I think you see that a ton. And for me, those are some of the nicest and the best people that I've met are these people in the open source community who are sort of doing all this work and taking time away from their normal life just because they enjoy it and because they want to do it. It also, again, sort of transpires into this progression for people's career. Like you have a public track record of making high quality contributions, which I think is super important and pays dividends in the long run. And also, again, this Julia or some other open source project could be the tool that folks use to solve some really new and interesting problems. And again, I think the personalized medicine example is a great one. Like there's, Pumas isn't a $100 billion organization, and it's just a group of a few folks, 10 people or so, I'm not sure what the exact number is, who are really passionate about solving this problem. And they're using some of the cutting edge tools that exist out there to help solve it. So there's a lot of potential for things like this to really have a huge impact. And I'm glad that I got to share everything. So that's all I have. Hopefully folks thought this was interesting and helpful. And again, if there's questions from the audience or Santosh, happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, there is no question in chat, but yeah, I do have some questions. So how about, apart from the talks, are there any resources available like video courses which you prefer or which you suggest someone to use while learning Julia Lang?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we have right now on the Julia Languages website, if you go to there's a learning tab up at the top, and the learning tab actually breaks down learning Julia in like a bunch of different ways. So I think if folks are sort of more inclined to the traditional university experience, we have that available through the course at MIT and a bunch of other courses. If you want to learn through a textbook, because that's how you've learned every other programming language, there's Julia textbooks. You can pick up one of those for free, or pay for one if you want the paperback. And one of the most interesting sort of routes to learning Julia is this platform called exorcism.io. And this actually allows you to like do Julia challenges and actually get mentorship from a real person who programs in Julia all the time. It's a super great initiative, and something that I've helped out with in the past, and now there's a bunch of other people sort of leading that and doing an incredible job. Yeah, and the link's up on the screen. I think again, there's tons of resources there, and if there's something missing and you're like, hey, I want to learn this way, but I don't see that, feel free to message me or ping me somewhere, and I'll try to find whatever that resource is for you.
So how about the community, right? So do you have any Discord server where people can connect, or Slack channel, something?
Yeah, great question. Again, under the community tab on the Julia Languages website, we have a bunch of these resources laid out. I think the sort of main ones where you see a lot of people congregating these days are Discourse. Discourse is one of the big ones. Lots of Q&A happening there if people have questions about Julia. We do have a Slack workspace. We do have a Zulip workspace, which is sort of an open source analog to Slack. We have a Discord instance, which is sort of an unofficial Discord instance right now, but lots of different opportunities to talk to folks in the Julia community. I think, yeah, there's, the Slack and Zulip workspace I've been a part of for a while, and I think those are both awesome places to hang out. And the only thing that I ask is if you have Julia questions as far as like, how do I do certain things or where to go for certain resources, posting those on Discourse, which is the link you see up on the screen now, is definitely the right option. And again, the problem with Slack is that none of those things are accessible to people outside of the Slack workspace. So it sort of just takes the question and burns it after you ask it, which kind of stinks. But there's definitely some value if you just want to talk to folks. The Slack workspace is a great opportunity to do that. Lots of people in the Julia community are there.
Okay, thanks a lot. So yeah, I think we are done with the question. So Logan, anything you want to promote on the channel?
I think the only thing that comes to my mind is JuliaCon 2021 coming up. You can register at juliacon.org. It's going to be such our largest Julia conference ever. Largest number of submissions. Last year was obviously our first year doing a virtual conference because of COVID-19. It ended up being a huge success. We loved the virtual format because it made it so that anyone could come, anyone could participate. And obviously in previous years, we would have the conference internationally in certain cases, and people would have to travel and all this stuff. So really from an accessibility standpoint, the JuliaCon conferences being online is awesome. So tons of talks, tons of use cases, a bunch of opportunities to just meet people and hang out, which I think will be a ton of fun. Like that's what I actually work with all these people all the time. And the reality is like very infrequently do we ever, just sit down and chat, just because a lot of the, folks are so busy, and everyone, we're always chatting sort of asynchronously because that's the nature of open source. So it's going to be awesome to get to connect with people. And Santosh, I'm hoping to see you there. I'm hoping, I've convinced you to come and hang out for a little bit at JuliaCon. I think it'll be a ton of fun.
I just have registration page open, so once we are done, I'll just finish the registration.
Wonderful. Yeah. I'm super excited. So hopefully folks think that'll be exciting. Again, tons of cool Julia stuff that'll be talked about, sort of the state of Julia, what the future looks like, hundreds of use cases, all that stuff. So it's going to be a blast. I'm excited. It's coming up in July. So make sure you register.
Good. Yeah. So that's it for the day. We so thanks again, Logan, for joining us. And in case anyone wants to reach out, what is the best channel to reach out to you?
Yeah, shoot me a message on Twitter. My handle is official Logan K. Shoot me a message. Always happy to answer questions. I know there's a bunch of people who I owe messages to on Twitter and LinkedIn. So I apologize for the delay if you've already sent me a message, but always happy to help folks contribute to the Julia community if you have questions about getting started. So please feel free to shoot me a message, and I'll get back to you.
That's great. So yep, that's it for the day. Thanks everyone for joining us, and feel free to message Logan as you said in case you have any questions. And go ahead and just register for this JuliaCon 2021, which is happening in I think few days. What is the
I
last
think
day?
it's like a month from now or something like that.
Okay,
Yeah, middle
I
of
guess
middle of July.
July. Yep, yeah, it's in July. So go ahead and register it now, and I'll see you all over there. So that's it for the day. And on closing notes, we have another episode coming on Friday, which is happening at 10 p.m. IST, and we will be joined by Minko, who works at Google into dev advocacy team for Angular, and we will be talking about how you can write your own compiler. So that's for Friday, and have a great weekend or great week right now. So see you again on Friday.
Yep.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Santosh. This was great. Take care, everyone.